Okay, hi friends. So today I'm going to talk about foundations of cooperative AI. Before I dive into what that actually means, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Emin, I go by my middle name, and I'm a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon, and our lab is called the Foundations of Cooperative AI Lab, or FOCAL. And in a lot of our vision and future projects can be found in this overview paper by my advisor, Vincent Conitzer, and our lab member, Casper. And actually, a lot of these slides are borrowed by Vince, so if you're watching, Vince, thank you. So basically, what cooperative AI is interested in is this premise that as AI systems get control more and more of our world, it stands to reason that they're also going to be interacting with each other, increasingly without direct human supervision. And when algorithms interact with each other, oftentimes the consequences can be surprising and sometimes catastrophic. So this is what we're going to call the tragedy of algorithmic interaction. And the other idea is that the AI agents, as they become more advanced, their interactions also become more game theoretic. What that means is that they all have these objectives, they have different utility functions, they have different objective functions, and according to that, they have different strategies that they can follow. And as the AI community, we like to think about a lot of, I would argue that a lot of AI researchers do think of AI agents as anthropomorphic, as human-like, but that's not always the case, especially when these types of game theoretic interactions come into play. Game theory for humans have been studied for a long time, dating back to modern game theory, dating back to 1920s to von Neumann, and then to 1950s, famously to John Nash. But maybe AI agents are a little different than humans. So in order to demonstrate this, here's a story by Vince. So let's say that these are two autonomous vehicles in a highway, the orange one's behind the green one. And the orange one's like, if I tailgate you, will your occupant take back control and pull over? And this is the absolute worst thing that can happen to an autonomous vehicle. Maybe they get punished if their occupant takes over. So the green car really doesn't want this. And it says, what makes you think I would tell you? The orange car is like, you just did, better move aside now. The green car is like, you're bluffing. And the orange car is, are you willing to take that chance? So this seems like a very silly comic strip, and the part of the reason it feels silly is that we don't really expect AI agents to interact this way, right? This is how me and Sonia would interact with one another if we were driving behind each other in the highway. But AI agents are not necessarily this way, and I think this is the idea behind our lab's most projects, that we need new tools and new frameworks to deal with game theoretic interactions between AI agents. So a quick outline of the things I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to give some examples of tragedies of algorithmic interaction from real life. Then I'm going to talk about the idea of designing AI agents, or thinking of the design in the first place. Then I'll talk about, should AI agents cooperate the same way that we do? And then I'll talk about techniques for cooperation that do fit humans and also AI. And then I'm going to talk about a few that doesn't fit humans but do fit AI. And then I'm going to end with some open questions and call to action. Feel free to ask any questions, but we're also going to have a longer workshop later on. So if you have more detailed questions, I would love to see you in the workshop at 4. Okay, so let's start from some tragedies of algorithmic interaction from real life. So basically, here is a screenshot from Amazon, and it shows a book called The Making of a Fly, The Genetics of Animal Design. And as you can see, it's sold by two different sellers, one for $1.7 million and the other one for $2.1 million. No disrespect to the authors of the book. I'm sure it's an excellent book, but it's some 400 pages or something. And I doubt anyone really wants to pay millions of dollars for a paper that's also, for a book that's also probably available online. And what's going on here is actually later was the topic of a Wired article. And as you might have guessed, both of these sellers were determining their prices algorithmically. And there's a lot of text, but basically what happened was one of the sellers had set the algorithm to set the price of their book to 99% of what the competitor was selling. And the other one had set it to 1.27 times what the competitor was selling. So you might be like, why would someone want to pay, make it more expensive than the competitor? Maybe they wanted to appear more prestigious, or maybe they were doing this silly trick of buying it from another competitor and selling it to a more expensive price to make the margins. But what ended up happening is that since 1.27 is so much farther away than 0.99, the product of these numbers is also greater than 1. And basically they kept doing this arms race to the top until the final price reached $24 million. So this is like a funny example, but it doesn't seem that harmful, right? So maybe someone really wanted this book and couldn't buy it because of the silly prices, but it doesn't seem catastrophic. But I'd like to argue that these types of stuff can happen in more consequential context as well, as for example it did in 2010 in the flash crash in the United States, stock market crash. And we still don't know exactly what happened here, but one thing that's for sure is that high frequency traders and algorithmic trading was heavily involved. And due to some basic strategic interaction between these high frequency traders, these algorithmic bots, like trading bots, got into this like hot potato effect where they were constantly buying stuff, but they were like, oh, it's so hot, I want to sell it. So no one wanted to hold on to the things that they were buying. It resulted in a huge crash in the stock market. It did eventually recover, but it really does capture like this tragedy of commons, or like this hot potato effect having like a real world impact. And so imagine if this was happening in other contexts. For example, like if this hot potato effect happened in the electrical grid, or the cybersecurity, or cyber warfare, or even kinetic warfare, which might seem like far-fetched examples to you, but even today there are these AI models that actually, like for instance, AI, like Planetary is an AI platform with a large language model that you can ask for a plan or to attack an enemy, so a plan of action to attack an enemy, and something like tragedy of commons from game theory would be pretty tragic in a setup like this. So with that examples in mind, let's actually think about the idea of designing AI agents before we talk about the interactions between them. So dating back all the way to the famous textbook by Russell and Norvig, I'd like to argue that we as AI researchers for a very long time thought of AI agents as anthropomorphic to some degree, that they are similar to humans. So this is actually a figure from one of their chapters, and they have an entire chapter on designing agents. But you can see that it's very human-like with its interactions with the environment, right? There are some environments, there's an environment that the agent sends to its sensors, kind of like how humans get observations from our environment. They have like a utility function and they decide what to do. They have like a set of actions, and the decision they make affect the environment with changes, and again, in turn, affects like the sensors. So this is like an anthropomorphic way of like looking at AI agents. And what's more important is like, where does this utility function come from? So in their book, they say that it's imposed by some authority. And I think this is what a lot of AI researchers did for a long time, that we just assumed that the objective function was defined for us. And it's something that we took pride in, that we can design these agents that actually maximize any objective function that we'd like, that these like multi-purpose agents. But I really think this is actually like a stance that we moved away from over the years, because a lot of what AI alignment is about is actually specifying this utility function in a way to make sure that these unforeseen consequences that are catastrophic does not arise. So this idea of like picking what the utility function of the reward model is actually a big part of this AI alignment problem, right? So, and a lot of the talks that we saw in this summer school do relate to this in one form or another. But I'd like to argue that even if we had agents that are perfectly aligned with our human values like individually, we can still get these catastrophic outcomes when we have these perfectly aligned agents interact with one another in equilibrium. So for instance, here's a small example, very simple. Let's say we have two agents, okay? And they're providing some service, it doesn't matter what service, but they get to pick the quality of the service that they provide to the customers. And the overall quality, like the utility of the customer or the designer of the agent, the utility for humans, is determined by the minimum over these two. So all we care about is the agent with the minimum quality and the quality of their service. So in this case, let's say that we managed to align the agents pretty well. So they also primarily care about the quality, like the overall quality, like the minimum over the two. But let's also say that they get like this slight epsilon bonus for being the agent with the less quality. So why might that be? Maybe in the past, because when they had lower quality, more of the resources were dedicated to them, maybe more attention was paid. So somehow they learned to care a little bit about being the agent with the less quality, but overall their primary goal is pretty well aligned with the humans, and that they care about overall quality. So in a setup like this, so this is what game theorists call a normal form game. It's represented as a matrix. The rows and the columns represent the actions that can be taken by the two players, and every internal table entry is basically the utilities of the players that when this combination of actions are played. The row player's utility followed by the column player's utility. And as you can see, like these are like the various quality of actions that the agents can decide to play. And if they both play 100, that's pretty good. They also get like a bonus for tying, and it's 111, 111. What's really sad about this example is that this is actually not stable. And in fact, none of these internal nodes are, in fact, except for a single one. Because you can see that whichever cell that you start with, there is one thing that either of the players can do that they can unilaterally deviate to an alternative action that would increase their own utility. So if you started from 111 to 111, the row player can provide marginally less quality for 90. That would decrease the quality of service to 90, but they get this small bonus for being the lower one. So they're like slightly happier than they used to be. So they'll do that. But then the column player would do the same thing, basically until they ladder down, and the only stable outcome in this setup is this 11-11. So both players playing the absolute worst quality is the only stable equilibrium, whereas by stability I mean no one can gain by unilateral deviations. So this is actually what we call traveler's dilemma in game theory. It's pretty famous, but it has a different story. This is kind of like a AI version of it. But also like any learning algorithm that you can have with this matrix will converge to 11-11. You can choose your favorite regret minimizer and code this up in a few lines, and you'll see that it actually always very quickly converges to 11-11 if they only care about their own utility, if they only care about their own objective function, which we assume is the case by construction. And the sad thing about here is that these agents are actually very well aligned, right? They're always really close to each other, like at any given cell in terms of their utility, and they're very close to what humans wanted, like humans' utility in that outcome as well. So if the minimum quality, the quality of service is 50, one of the agents is getting exactly that. And like the difference between their utility and our utility is at most 22, which is not that far from like in the grand scheme of things. And you could make that difference like arbitrarily small just by adding more granularity to these actions, but I didn't want to like put like 100 times 100 matrix here. But you can make that difference arbitrarily small, which means that even if it's misaligned by some epsilon, it results in this like arms race that actually results in an outcome that's much worse than what we could have gotten as humans if both agents interacted in the way that we wanted them to interact. So hopefully this has like motivated you guys to show that like even if we got individual alignment, that might not be enough to get outcomes that we want in multi-agent settings. This is actually a generalization of the more famous example called prisoner's dilemma. I suspect some of you or most of you might have seen this in some introductory game theory or econ course, or maybe just in pop culture. So this is like a case where we have two agents and they can both cooperate or defect. And if they both cooperate, it's pretty good. They get 2 and 2. But regardless of what the other agent does, you're better off defecting. Like if the other agent is cooperating, you're better off defecting in order to get 3 instead of 2. If the other agent's defecting, you're still better off defecting, getting 1 instead of 0. So the only equilibrium is defect, defect, whereas cooperate, cooperate, Pareto dominates that, meaning that it's better for every player involved. And this is pretty famous in game theory. The reason I'm presenting it here is that we're going to come back to this example in the future. So a quick interlude on before I introduce methods for cooperation, is this philosophical question perhaps that should AI agents cooperate in the same way humans do in the first place? Is that what we should aim for? And one possible answer to this is yes, because humans do cooperate a lot. One might argue that this is what sets us apart as a species. We're really wired to be these like social creatures. Like a lot of neuroscience research has shown that we have these mirror neurons that make us care about each other and so on and so forth. And really like human species have achieved a lot through the power of cooperation. And this might be a motivator to have AI agents cooperate in the same way we are. But if you do the same Google search slightly differently, you get an entirely different story. The other side of the coin is that there are actually a lot of stuff that we failed at cooperating. And in fact, a lot of this is like these really important global issues like climate change and poverty. And that really shows us maybe there are some limits to human cooperation. So the gist of that, in my opinion, is saying that there are a lot of good things about human cooperation that we would want AI to kind of emulate, but we don't want to limit ourselves by human cooperation models, and maybe we want to take it a notch further. Okay, so now let's get into some specific techniques of how we achieve cooperation. First, I'm going to talk about methods of cooperation, like game theoretic cooperation that fit into humans as well. Like first of all, in real life, you can think of a lot of cases that like we do find ourselves in that are prisoner's dilemma, like that we would objectively be better off if we just acted selfishly and didn't care about the person in front of us. And yet, in a lot of cases, we find ourselves not doing that, right? You don't really backstab every single person that you see in life. And why is that? Like, one might argue that because we're inherently moral creatures and we do care about some like higher ideal like justice or empathy. Game theorists are much more cynical. They say, no, 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 you only care about yourself, but you care about yourself in the long run. So like anyone that you interact with, you don't only interact with them once, but in real, like most of the cases, you keep on interacting with them again and again. So there are some costs on like backstabbing people. Probably they're not going to trust you anymore. They might change your behavior towards each other. And this is captured by game theorists in what they call infinitely repeated versions of the game. So the same game as before, Prisoner's Dilemma, but now the two players don't play it a single time, they play it infinitely many times. So in this case, consider the Grim Trigger strategy, which is what I call like, we cooperate forever with the other player, but if I see them defecting, I'm like, that's it, I'm never going to trust this person again, and I switch to forever defecting. So in a setup like this, if the players are patient enough, which means that if they have discount factors that are close enough to 1, if they care sufficiently enough about the future, this actually will become a stable equilibrium, because it's true, when you're cooperating, you can still gain 1 by defecting, but that will make the other player switch to forever defecting. So that means you're gonna, whereas you could have won 2 in all future rounds, now you're maximized in your utility by winning at most 1. So they're punishing you at least 1 in every future round. So the short-term gains of like gaining 1 in this round is going to be offset by the retaliation of the other player in every future round. And this actually is generalized by these things that we call folk theorems, that actually we can achieve this type of cooperation in infinitely repeated games with patient players in any game, not just this Prisoner's Dilemma, as long as it satisfies some rationality constraints. And it also is, from a computational perspective, these folk theorems are pretty nice because they also are constructive. They give us a method for efficiently computing these equilibria. Okay, but this type of equilibria can actually, this type of cooperation can actually be quite brittle. This is actually a paper that just got published, or will get published in Ishkai. I'm presenting it in a few weeks with Vince. And the common assumption that we're making in a lot of these repeated games is that an agent's partner is fixed. But in real life, we actually have these setups where agents, true, they interact in partners, but there's a large pool of players that can match and rematch all the time. Like, for example, you can think of like the trading market where a lot of people are trading, but at any given like point, the interaction happens between a single buyer and a single seller. You can think of the monogamous dating market where like everyone's dating someone, but all around you people are dating each other. You can think of like two-person research collaborations where we have this pool of players, but the agents have the ability to leave their partner and restart the game with someone else. So what happens in this case is that a player can defect. I can like cheat on someone else in Prisoner's Dilemma, and I immediately leave them to avoid retaliation. So this gives, like, if we provide agents with anonymity, which means that they don't have a reputation factor, which is a much more realistic assumption with AI agents because it's hard to check for the identity of an AI agent than it's to check the identity of human. What happens is that we get this emergence of these serial cheaters, that basically we get these agents that continuously rematch and continuously like cheat on their partner to move on to the next person. And the cooperation that we very easily could achieve in the previous infinitely repeated game version completely falls apart. Well, fortunately, we showed that in this paper. We showed that there is still cooperative equilibria, and even though it's like NP hard to find, at most times there are some practice in like pseudo-polynomial, efficient in practice algorithms that we present, and this setup is actually going to be the topic of our workshop in the afternoon, where we're going to rederive some of the results that lead up to these algorithms and these hardness results. So if you're interested in like these types of algorithmic approaches to game theory, I'd love to see you guys there. So now we talked about cooperation in the context of humans, like, or at least cooperation in the context that can also be applied to humans. Let's talk about things that are like, let's talk about techniques that wouldn't really necessarily fit to humans, but when we start talking about AI agents that kind of start to make more sense. So one thing is the idea of simulation. So simulating a human being seems a little funky. Like you can think of like, okay, I'm gonna like model my roommate and like exactly try to like predict their behavior. But without limited understanding of neuroscience, it seems pretty unfeasible to do accurate simulation of how someone would act in this, at least within the time frame that we're working in. That's not so much the case with AI agents, right? Especially AI agents with like open source code or have like access to each other. It's pretty easy to simulate an AI agent. You can run it as many times as you want, and you can kind of observe the behavior of the AI agent before you actually play the game itself. So this is the old Trust game, dating all the way back to 1995. The story is that we have two players, player one and player two, and this is what we call an extensive form game. So remember that the Matrix was a normal form game where players acted simultaneously. In extensive form games, they take rounds, so there's like non-simultaneity here, right? P1 is going to decide on something, and P2 is going to decide on something afterwards. And the story is that P1 has like $5, and they can either walk out, not play this game, and just keep that $5 to themselves. Again, the utilities are the player one followed by player two. Or they can trust this P2, and P2 maybe is like some trading genius that is gonna triple the money. And when they triple the money, they can either cooperate, like give back the 10 maybe as they have promised to P1, and then keep 5 for themselves. So now P1 has their money doubled, but P2 also gets like a 5 bonus for their service, like a commission fee. But P2, having the money, can also try to defect and run away and just keep the entirety of 15 to themselves. So in this case, the way that the game theorist would solve this game is to start from the bottom. So given that we're in this node, that P1 has already decided trust, what P2 would do is they have every incentive to defect, right? Like the past is in the past. There's no point in like cooperating because P1 has already trusted. So the dominant strategy of P2 is to just defect here. And P1 can perfectly predict this and would rather get 5 than 0, and P1 walks out. So the only stable equilibrium in this game is 5-0, whereas they would have been both better off if they just came over here. So this is like a famous example from 1995, but in a paper by our lab members led by Wojta, they actually study this setting and more generally games in this setup, like these generalized trust games, when we add simulation. So the twist is now, let's say player 2 is not like a banker or like some human, but it's actually some like bot, like not Bob, but Bobble, that there's like some crypto bot or some computer mechanism that is capable of like tripling your money, but it's also capable of being simulated. So now we give P1 the ability to simulate the player 2, and player 2 will basically act twice, simulated and then like the non-simulated version. In order to simplify down this tree, I'm assuming that in the simulation, if P1 detects that P2 defects, then they just walk out. They're like, well, I'm not going to trust this bot. And if they see that in the cooperation they cooperate, then they also trust. You can, like, the actual game tree is a little larger because P1 needs to make a decision, but you can show that it reduces down to this by eliminating strictly dominated actions. But basically what happens here, we also give like P1 a simulation cost of 1. So if they decide to simulate, their utilities are decreased by 1 compared to the non-simulation versions. So can someone tell me what the best strategy for P2 to do in this case? Does anyone have a guess? Like, what would you do if you were P2 in this game's tree?
Cooperate.
Cooperate where?
Like both, so 95 is the outcome.
Okay, so cooperate here, so that how about here?
No,
Defect, right? So perhaps a trivially meaningful thing for the P2 to do is like, okay, in the simulation, I'm going to cooperate, but then I'm going to defect in real life once I gain the trust. And this actually is not that far-fetched. Does anyone remember the emission scandal of Volkswagen from 2015? Basically, what they did there was like they programmed Volkswagen cars to be able to detect whether they were being run in a lab or in like outside the lab. And if it was inside the lab, the emissions would be less. It would emit less carbon dioxide, and on the outside, it would just emit like a whole lot more. So this type of like tricky, let's detect simulation and act accordingly is actually something that we see in real life. But the trick is that we need to make this indistinguishable to player 2. So player 2 needs to not be able to tell apart whether they're being simulated or not, which again, as humans, it feels a little weird for this kind of setup. But for AI agents, if you manage the observations quite well, you can actually arrange it so that P2 cannot detect whether they're being simulated or not, at least from any observation from the outside. So game theorists use these like dashed lines to indicate indistinguishability, or in other terms, we say that all three of these nodes are in the same information set. So P2, when it's time to act, they don't know if they're being simulated, they don't know if it's the real game after the simulation, or they don't know if it's the real game without any simulation. And in this setup, what happens is it's a little more complicated to solve because now we have to, P2 needs to have a self-locating belief. We need to have like a some probability distribution by P2 to determine what the probability of them being simulated right now is. And this is what we call self-locating beliefs. And like computing equilibria in this case is a little harder than the backpropagation that we did just a second ago. But I can tell you, if you trust me, that in this case, there is actually cooperation. We don't get cooperation 100% of the time, but we get it often enough that it actually both players are better off than the walkout defect outcome. And the reason this game is complicated is it has what we call imperfect recall. So you can see that like a lot of imperfect information games exist for humans as well, like poker. You can't tell apart, like you know your cards are, but I don't know if my opponent has a king or an ace and so on and so forth. But what's special about this game is it doesn't only have imperfect information, it also has imperfect recall. So that means that basically over here, information that was previously available to player 2 is forgotten later on. So player 2 decides to cooperate, and then it forgot about the fact that it was simulated and decided to cooperate. And these imperfect recall games are not well studied in game theory literature because a lot of the time it doesn't make sense to assume this for human players. Like humans do forget, but it's hard to model how they forget. And more importantly, you can't really force a human to forget something in most cases. Whereas with AI agents, this makes a lot more sense, like forceful forgetting, determining like when to reset the memory in what way has a lot more meaning. And that's why studying imperfect recall games make much more sense, even though it complicates things quite a bit. So this is why I think it's pretty interesting to study game theory with AI agents, because it leads to all these philosophical questions that for humans it seems a little far-fetched and maybe like an interesting like mental exercise to like, you know, when you're bored. But with AI agents, it's actually pretty consequential how we think about things. Like, what would you do if you knew others could read your mind? What would you do if you were facing someone running the same code as you were? What would you do if you knew that you had been in the same situation before, but you can't possibly remember what you did? So yeah, like reading someone's mind seems like someone reading our mind seems a little far-fetched. Like facing someone who's exactly like us, these are two twin astronauts, I believe, is also like having someone exactly identical to us for humans doesn't make sense even for twins. And I think this is a movie where this like forgetting thing happens. I didn't watch it, so don't ask me questions about that. But yeah, a lot of these relate to like concepts that do exist from literature but haven't been well studied. For example, very quickly, back to Prisoner's Dilemma, what we call program equilibrium is when like the two players submit two programs rather than playing it themselves. And imagine if both players submitted this program saying, if the other's code is exactly my code, then cooperate, otherwise defect. So if both players submit this, you can see that this is actually a stable equilibrium because it reaches cooperate, cooperate. But if blue player changes anything, then player 1 will immediately defect. That means that player 2 cannot possibly gain by doing anything else because the most it can win in that situation is 1 or 0, whereas it previously won 2. But this is a very brittle equilibrium again, right? Like maybe I accidentally add like a space over here, maybe like I indented a little bit too much, and the other player is like, nope, not my code, I'm going to defect on this guy. So, so one of Casper's older papers actually talks about how we can make this more robust by just like running the other program and do what it would do to you, but adding like a little the probability of cooperating at each round to avoid infinite recurrence. So this is actually a part I'm going to skip for time purposes, but happy to talk about it more in the workshop. And as I mentioned, imperfect recall is like a little interesting because AI systems can deliberately forget or recall. This actually, imperfect recall games have already been used in poker playing AI. So poker is a very large game. Like the number of decision nodes is like more than the number of atoms in the universe and by a lot. And it's really hard to have a bot that solves that game theoretically. But by having these abstractions of the poker game, like smaller games in which there's imperfect recall, where agent actually forgets things along the way, you can solve a smaller version of the game. And what Thomas Sundholm and Kroer showed that these actually do map quite well to the bigger game. And this is actually what the current, I believe, world champion poker bot Pluribus developed in Carnegie Mellon uses, these abstractions with imperfect recall, and it was developed in 2016. But things do get weird. And one way in which things get weird is that whereas we're guaranteed to have a Nash equilibrium in imperfect recall games, Nash equilibrium may no longer exist in imperfect recall games. So very quickly, Nash equilibrium is an equilibrium where no one has any incentive to deviate whatsoever. So very quickly think of this game where we have two players. The blue player is like a soccer player, or I'll just call it football, sorry to Americans. And they decide to either shoot left or right. And the orange player is the goalkeeper. They decide to jump to the blue player's left or right. And if they jump in the same direction, this is a zero-sum game, so the utilities are the blue player's utilities, and the orange player just gets minus of this. So if they jump in the same direction, player one's unhappy. If they jump in different directions, then player one is happy because they scored. But the twist is that player one needs to act twice. And if they miscoordinate between the two times, then they automatically get -1. So and they forget what they did in the first round. So you can put your favorite story here. One story I like to tell is that maybe player one has two different sets of shoes. One's better for left shooting, the other one's better for right shooting. They put one on before the game and then they forgot what they did. As I said, this doesn't really make too much sense for human players, but with AI players, it does make much more sense. And in this case, there's no Nash because this is like a matching pennies game. And if you know the matching pennies game, the best thing to do is to play 50-50 because anything you put more than 50 on one direction, the other player can basically exploit you. But in this case, playing 50-50 on both nodes lead to miscoordination 50% of the time. So player one is better off just like playing in a single direction and getting 50% win rate, even when we fix the strategy of the other player. I know this I went through a little fast, but this is a very interesting example of why classical game theory assumptions don't really generalize to imperfect recall, and I'm happy to talk more about this in the break or in the workshop. So we need these relaxation of Nash called, for example, two solution concepts are called evidential decision theory and causal decision theory, and it has to do with this belief of now you get to deviate in an information set. If you deviate now, will you deviate every other time you find yourself in this situation? Or is this a one-shot deviation? And you can actually show that playing 50-50 in this game is a CDT equilibrium, and it's always guaranteed to exist. My lab mate Emmanuel and his collaborators actually wrote a paper last year proving, for people who are more CS theory oriented, they proved the complexity of computing various of these generalizations, relaxations of Nash equilibrium. And in fact, this year in Ichika, in a few weeks, they're going to be presenting the sequel paper in which they do the multiplayer generalization of this. And almost lastly, so imperfect recall can perhaps counterintuitively help you as well. So forgetting things might be useful for you without any computational bounds, even if the game's not that big. So this is a forthcoming paper by me, Emmanuel, Johannes, and Liz. And in this case, we show, we compute the value of recall for various game classes in general. But here's a toy example, kind of like the similar trust game as before, instead quadrupling the money rather than tripling. But the player two, in order to run away with it, it acts twice, and perhaps if it immediately defects, they get caught by the police or something. But if they appear to be cooperating first and then defecting, they get away with the money. Of course, with perfect recall, they're going to cooperate first and then defect, kind of like that simulation example from before. But if we give, and then the only equilibrium is just 1-0 because P1 predicting this will work out. But if we give imperfect recall to P2, then you can show that the only CDT, the only EDT, and the only Nash equilibrium here is playing 2-2. So suddenly, by giving imperfect recall to this player, both them and P1 were better off. So imperfect recall can help both players and achieve cooperation. It's also useful in other places, like imperfect recall. We already talked about abstractions of game trees, but it's also useful in privacy. You can think of ChatGPT or any language model as one big agent that interacts with me, then forgets, and then interacts with the next person. And maybe I'm okay with trusting ChatGPT with my personal information only if I'm guaranteed that it's going to forget all my information by the end of our interaction. But that's one other way of justifying. So in summary, basically, game theoretic failures to cooperate can happen even when we have perfectly aligned agents. And some of these ways of getting cooperation make sense for humans, while others don't, but they make sense for AI agents. And that means that we don't need to unnecessarily limit our toolkit. We can use these tools that don't make sense for humans, such as So the things that do make sense for humans, such as infinite repetition is good, but we also have these like simulations and imperfect recall that doesn't necessarily make sense for humans, but do make sense for AI agents. And lastly, finishing up with some open questions. So this is the core question that we try to answer in our lab focal at CMU. What are the foundations of game theory for highly advanced AI, and how should we think about agents that have overlapping code with visible open code? What should we think about agents that can be simulated if they can't remember the past, if they have imperfect recall? What design decisions can improve cooperation? How realistic are these? How robust are these? And what is the role of learning in these setups? Can we have learning algorithms that converge to good CDT equilibria or good ETD equilibria? And what about the context of logical uncertainty? And insert any other favorite question that you would like to insert here. And thank you so much for your attention.
So you have time for a few short questions. So okay, can I get some?
Thank you for your talk. In terms of predicting game theoretic behavior for this multi-agent setting, you touched on this a bit, but I'm curious as to how you're measuring situational awareness in the models, or if that's something you're taking into account to determine whether they're in training or deployment, say like through out-of-context reasoning, and if so, are you using that information to calculate the expected value of defecting? Or
Can you repeat your last sentence?
yeah, are you using the information of situational awareness in these models to determine the expected outcome of defecting or cooperating?
Yeah, you're right that like in setups where we have agents forgetting or when they're being simulated and stuff, situational awareness becomes like a huge part of like solving this like game theoretical tree or matrix or whatever you'd like to represent it in. And there are a lot of like different ways in which like people justify how these agents need to like form a self-locating belief system over which node that they're in. And some of these are like conflicting with each other. And actually they give like quite different computational results. Like some of them are harder to compute, some of them are easier to compute. So that gives you like these like philosophical questions as well. Is something being easier to compute justify that like situational awareness system over another? And it is very much related to these older hypothetical philosophical questions like the sleeping beauty problem. I don't know if you've heard of it, but basically like the focal paper talks a lot about those. I'm also happy to chat about like how those come into play in these types of games.
I'm wondering if you have any ideas if you could apply this game theoretical concept to improve techniques like debate that are beginning to be used with LLMs.
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, I guess we were chatting with Vikrant about this a few days ago that there are these papers that, for instance, AI safety on debate that do assume some sort of game structure on the original thing and make like complexity theoretical results about this. And I think definitely like large language models like playing in like these game theoretical settings is like a very interesting topic, and more papers are coming out about this. Generative social choice by Ariel Procace is one of them. There are some members in our lab that are working on papers about this as well, but to quickly answer your question, yes.
I'm just curious about like how confident are you that advanced AI systems would converge to the abstractions that you're using as part of this game theoretical models to analyze cooperation?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and this is where, like, even though most of the stuff I talked about here are theoretical, I think it's very important to complement these with empirical research. And there are a lot of like multi-agent reinforcement learning researchers that actually do like work on these types of models that use different learning algorithms. And I think a lot of the times there has been empirical proof that it does converge to the solution concepts that we would expect them to converge to. And in fact, you can think about this as like kind of like how this also may be an answer to why game theory might be even better at explaining AI than humans, because like humans, we do have like our like incentives and stuff, but we're not that quantitative, right? Like I don't have a number for cheating on my friend that like I don't know how much I need to shift my utilities in order to make sure I backstab my like childhood friend or something like that. Whereas like a lot of AI agents have these like quantitative objective functions, and under the right modeling of their objectives, game theoretical models actually become really accurate, surprisingly really accurate, even with like small codes and small learning algorithms at predicting their behavior. And of course, as it gets more and more complicated, then predicting behavior becomes more and more difficult. But I think that's a very exciting avenue of research to see, like to produce results that help or maybe destroy our confidence in the convergence to these solution concepts.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course.
Thanks. So super sharp. Short one question.
I was just wondering if can you say more about the theory of impact of this kind of work? Like, for example, what might AI lab or a government do differently given your results?
Yeah. I mean, like, of course, like I think I love theory work, but I think like it's also important to think about the deployability of a theorem and like how useful it is for actual like applications. I mean, the most immediate way in which these results can be used is like for game playing AI, right? Like a lot of these like recent recent optics in superhuman behavior in like in diplomacy by Cicero or in poker by Pluribus, by AlphaGo Zero, do use a lot of these game theoretical concepts. It's not just reinforcement learning. They actually do use a lot of game theory to make use heuristics that make the game tree much easier to solve too. In terms of a more AI safety point of view, I think there's a lot of like great workshops at each guy about this in a few weeks called like for instance CompSoc and AI governance that actually do involve algorithmic game theoretical methods. But I think understanding the ways in which AI interact with each other and understanding how these tools can help us reach more cooperative outcomes can also help us regulate AI models in a way that maybe would like minimize the risk of like emergent behavior that we cannot predict. In terms of the more like policy side, I'm not an expert, so I wouldn't want to be like imposing any views on like solutions. But I think like understanding behavior and understanding like which outcomes can arise, it should be the first step in regulating in a way that we would eliminate the bad outcomes that we don't want. So I kind of see this as a tool of like seeing what multi-agent strategic behavior will give rise to. And if we have these results that, okay, under these imperfect recall conditions or under these game classes, we can guarantee this much cooperation, or we can guarantee like this much like utility for the social, for social welfare, then that will help us like guide designing and regulating future AI models.